Welcome to Nebraskanomics, where we help Nebraskans remove barriers to opportunity with policy research and legislative advice. I'm your host, Jim Vokal, CEO of the Platte Institute, a Nebraska-based think tank promoting policies that make it easier to get a good job, start a business, and help Nebraskans keep more of what they earn. If you want more economic freedom in Nebraska, then let's get started. Welcome to this edition of Nebraskanomics. I'm Jim Vokal, your host, and I'm pleased to be joined by our Senior Research Fellow and former State Senator, Laura Ebke. Laura, welcome back to Nebraskanomics.
Thanks, Jim. Glad to be with you today.
You know, we do a lot of good work. Certainly everything that we do from tax policy to regulatory policy and everything we work on deals with removing barriers in our state. But there are some issues that we work on that just at the end of the day make us feel a little bit better about our work, just because of the impact that the policies that we advocate for and get across the finish line. And today's discussion centers around the second chance opportunities that were part of some legislation that was passed last session, not in 2026. And I think it'd be just good, Laura, if we just start by giving our listeners a little background on this new second chance mini documentary that we have produced, and what is the project and how did Platte become involved? And we can certainly talk about the legislation as well surrounding that.
Sure. So, as a lot of people are aware, Platte has a lot of network connections with different state and national policy organizations across the country. And we work with them on a lot of issues and attend many of the same policy meetings around the country, help each other out whenever we can. And so one of those organizations, the Atlas Network, heard about the passage of LB 16 and wondered whether there might be some stories related to the criminal justice or second chances portion of that bill that could be told using their video team. And we said yes. And then we put some of those things together. They sent a team out like late last summer for 3 or 4 days. It was really interesting to see how the process works, the videography process works. Jim, I know you were a part of that too, but multiple cameras and multiple takes. And we videoed many more hours than ended up in the actual video.
That's very helpful. So before we dive into the video itself, let's remind our listeners what LB 16 actually did, particularly, Laura, the second chances and the occupational licensing reforms that were included in the legislation.
Sure. So Platte's been involved, as we all know, in a lot of occupational licensing reform over the last decade. We created a review structure in LB 299 back in 2018, and that bill also included a predetermination for those with prior criminal records. It allowed them to find out from licensing boards whether their background would prevent them from obtaining state licensure in particular fields. Then over the course of 3 or 4 legislative sessions, we worked on what became eventually LB 16. And that bill had 2 primary components. One has gotten more attention than others, but the first component was that it created a system of universal recognition whereby someone who was licensed in another state in an occupation licensed in Nebraska could come to Nebraska and receive licensure without having to jump through additional educational or experiential hoops. The second component, relevant to the video that we're talking about today, was the second chances component for those who had been incarcerated and completed their sentence. The law now requires that licensing boards specify what convictions can be disqualifying for licensure and requires that the disqualifying offenses have some relationship to the license that would be sought. It really opens up a lot of opportunity for a lot of people who have gotten into trouble with the law at some point and paid their debt to society.
So for someone who may not be familiar with these barriers, what did life look like for a formerly incarcerated person before these reforms, Laura? What kinds of opportunities were being blocked off? On the flip side, what changed after LB 16 was passed? What new pathways and opportunities are now available that weren't really realistic before?
Sure. So for most who've been incarcerated, one of the first things that they need when they complete their sentence is a job. They need a place to live, but they need a job. And people who have spent time in prison don't necessarily want just any job like you or I. You have dreams, you have places that you want to go, areas that you think you would be better in than others. So often they've received training or education in prison that's motivated them to dream about a particular career path. And unfortunately, sometimes they found out too late that they were busy learning and hoping to take a licensing test, only to find out, after spending the time and money and training, that they would be declined or denied a license because of their background. At one interim study hearing we had on this topic a couple of years ago, we heard about a woman. She came and testified, who had been in prison on a drug charge when she was 19 or 20 years old, and she started taking college classes while she was in prison, and then got out. She finished her bachelor's degree and then decided that she'd like to study psychology and eventually become a mental health professional to help others who had struggled with drug use. She got her master's degree, and as she was applying for a doctoral program in Nebraska, she was told by the school that there wasn't much point in her doing that because Nebraska law wouldn't allow her to be licensed, no matter how long it had been or how qualified she was with a doctoral degree, because the conviction was on her record, and the status of the law at the time was that those with any kind of conviction couldn't get licensed in the mental health profession field. So she actually left Nebraska to pursue the career path in a state that didn't have those barriers. So while that's just one example out of many that we've heard over time of people who've had trouble getting into real estate or firefighting or all sorts of things. So while there are probably while there's still probably work for us to do, this sort of broad grant of authority that often allowed licensing boards to deny licenses based on, so-called moral character grounds, broad grounds, any conviction ever and ever, has been diminished significantly. And people like, the two gentlemen that we'll see on the video, they now have a real hope of entering an occupational area that they're interested in, but they were previously locked out of because of these sort of broad grants. And most of the licensing boards would have told them that, oh, well, it's not impossible, but it's just awfully tough for them to get in because they were forced to answer all sorts of questions in perpetuity, and and provide all sorts of extra hoops to jump through.
So people out there might be saying to themselves, "Whoa, this Platte Institute, I thought they were just this free market think tank dealing with taxes. Why is this issue so important to Platte to engage in, Laura? I mean, this isn't probably an area people immediately associate with a free market think tank, but in reality, there's a strong workforce, as you've pointed out, an economic opportunity component here."
Oh, absolutely. So, you're right. We don't generally dabble in the criminal justice arena very often. But this really is a workforce issue. Nebraska needs workers. I mean, everybody says that. Nebraska needs workers. We need people, and people who are given the opportunity to work in fields that they're interested in are far more likely to stick with it. Far less likely to recidivate, and go back to prison if they've got a good job. And, we don't want people returning to prison from both a human and an economic standpoint, I think. Last time I checked, it costs the state at least $40,000 a year for each person who is incarcerated in our state correction system. If more of those folks exiting the system can stay out, because they've found work that's fulfilling for them, it's really a win-win for both those individuals and the taxpayer.
Yeah, when you talk to employers and lawmakers and even the general public about the issue, I think there's been a shift in attitudes around second chance and workforce reentry. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think the more we talk about the issue and that folks understand what we're talking about, the more of a shift we see. This isn't sort of a soft on crime issue. What this is really is, people who have paid their debt to society based on the sentences that they were given. There's some obvious and understandable discomfort with the idea of people who've been incarcerated, for whatever that reason was, being granted licenses to do things that might have them in contact with the public in positions of trust. But once people understand that, first, these are not people who are out early on parole, but rather people who have, completely finished their sentence, including parole. Um, there's an easing of that concern. And then likewise, we all recognize that there's this need for workers that, we mentioned just a few minutes ago. And so if people like the men in our video are interested in putting in the work to improve their lives, maybe we should let them.
I think what was so great about this documentary too is people coming forward and telling their personal stories. And we know that our white papers and our research, our best practices sell, but it even sells more when people step forward and talk about their personal lives and how policy and legislation could potentially open up opportunities and eliminate some barriers. You mentioned a couple, but were there any personal stories that stood out to you in this documentary that you want to share?
Yeah, so the film really focuses on two men, Mitchell and Junior, who spent time incarcerated, and when they got out, they had dreams for what they would do next. And the dreams initially were blocked in large part because of the licensing structure that we had. Um, in both cases, one on camera, the day that we were filming, and the other in pre-production. We found out that, these guys didn't know about LB16 at that point. And when we told them about it, they were psyched. And by the time we filmed, Mitchell, the one who had discovered the law during our pre-production discussions, had already enrolled in classes to move forward in his chosen career. The other was going to look into it, was excited because he had just taken a job with RISE, it's one of the local reentry organizations in the state, and he would be able to tell others um, exiting the system that there was actually hope for them. So, for those of us in the policy world, when you see things like that happen, it's really gratifying. We know theoretically that our stuff is supposed to work, but when we actually see it work for individuals, it's really a good thing.
So thinking of LB16 more broadly, Laura, are people actually utilizing the reforms that were within that legislation, and are enough Nebraskans aware that these opportunities exist now?
You know, that's the question that I'm probably the most concerned about, the question of utilization. There are 2 points to that. One, I think, is whether the licensing boards have adapted their practices and actually implemented those changes, and whether and then the second part is whether those leaving incarceration are being made aware of the opportunities. And I think that the word is starting to get out. I think that this video will help that as well. I had a brief email exchange with one of the deputy directors of the Department of Corrections the other day. She's really interested in helping to spread the word as part of their rehabilitative efforts. And will she said as soon as we were ready that they'd be happy to share it through the Nebraska Department of Corrections social media posts and things like that too. So we've made good connections with, in addition to the Department of Corrections, several reentry groups that work with those leaving the system, and they're eager to ensure that their clients know about the opportunities that may be newly available to them. The bill was passed in 2024, so we're less than 2 years into it. So I hope that we can continue to spread the word and see even more good results.
So let's talk about the documentary itself. What are the plans for it moving forward, Laura, and how are we hoping to distribute it and make sure it reaches the people who could benefit from it most?
It's up on the Platte Institute's YouTube channel, and that will be linked in the product in the podcast description. We'll also share it on our social media channels, and we'll make sure that legislators and our partners in the LB16 effort have it. And then later this summer, we're going to try to put together an event that would allow interested parties to come and watch the film together And then we'll have a brief panel discussion with folks who've been able to either take advantage of the new law, those who've seen the bill's effect, and so on. And we'll probably try to engage some policy folks involved in this effort as well to see if we can come up with some new ideas for the next steps or things that could be done to further enhance the opportunities.
Well, speaking of next steps, are there additional reforms or next step legislation Nebraska should be looking at to continue expanding opportunity and removing unnecessary barriers to work, Laura?
Well, there are always next steps, always other things that we can do to reduce barriers. But structurally, I think Nebraska is in a really good place, a far better place than it was even a decade ago. We have reviews, we have second chances, we have universal recognition in our occupational licensing arena. The next thing I'd really like to see us do is to create a more robust reporting system. From our licensing board. So one that will actually tell us how many people have taken advantage of either the second chance opportunities or universal recognition. There's that old saying in business that says you value what you count, and I think that's the case here. That if we start counting those things, that we will come up with new ways of finding opportunities for folks. We start counting and how many people in Nebraska with great jobs might not have had them otherwise. I think that's a good thing.
Our second chance mini documentary is now public. It's a project with our partners that I'm really proud of, and certainly proud of the legislation that Laura helped champion back in 2024 and LB 16 that allowed for these opportunities. My guest today on Nebraskanomics has been our research senior fellow, Laura Ebke. Laura, thanks for joining me on Nebraskanomics.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you want more economic freedom in Nebraska, please visit platteinstitute.org to make a donation to help fund our research and advocacy. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter and learn about today's most important issues facing Nebraskans. It's time to stop the status quo. Let's remove economic barriers and make Nebraskans proud.